There is a specific kind of frustration that shows up in German after-action reports whenever commando units are involved. A frustration that goes beyond ordinary battlefield disappointment and edges into something closer to bewilderment. German officers, describing engagements against these units in reports intended purely for internal military use, repeatedly struggled to explain how positions that had held against other attacking forces under similar or even more difficult circumstances, simply failed to stop men who kept coming forward despite wounds, despite mounting casualties, despite every conventional expectation of when an attacking force ought to withdraw and regroup. Time and again, the phrase that surfaces in these accounts, translated across different documents and different soldiers, amounts to roughly the same sentiment, that these particular attackers seemed, in the most literal and frustrating sense, almost impossible to stop. One of the clearest early illustrations of this quality emerged from the disastrous raid on Dieppe in August 1942, an operation that, taken as a whole, is remembered rightly as a costly failure for the main Canadian assault force that bore the brunt of the fighting on the central beaches. Yet within that larger tragedy, the commando units operating on the flanks of the main landing produced results that stood in striking contrast to the chaos unfolding elsewhere along the coast, and German accounts of these specific engagements reveal precisely why. Number 4. Commando tasked with destroying a coastal artillery battery near the village of Varengeville that threatened to devastate the main landing force with plunging fire, executed an assault that German defenders themselves later described in terms bordering on disbelief. The commandos landed, fought their way inland through defended positions, stormed the battery itself in close combat, destroyed the guns with demolition charges, and withdrew again, all within a tightly compressed window of time, achieving completely what they had set out to do, while much of the wider raid collapsed into disorder around them. German gunners manning that battery, several of whom survived to be questioned afterward, described an assault that moved with a speed and coordination they had simply not anticipated from a raiding force of that size. One surviving artillery officer noted that his position had been considered reasonably secure, protected by wire, machine gun positions, and the natural difficulty of the surrounding terrain. Yet the attacking commandos had adapted to each obstacle with what he described as unsettling fluidity, finding routes around strong points rather than attempting to force them directly, using covering fire to pin down defenders while flanking elements closed the remaining distance, and pressing the final assault on the guns themselves with a violence that left defenders little opportunity to organize any kind of sustained resistance. By the time reinforcements from other nearby positions attempted to respond, the battery had already been destroyed, and the commando force was already withdrawing back toward the beach. A sequence of events that German commanders reviewing the incident afterward found genuinely difficult to reconcile with their prior assumptions about how quickly a raiding force of that size could realistically achieve such a complete objective under fire. This particular quality, adapting instantly to unexpected resistance rather than being slowed or deterred by it, recurs constantly throughout German testimony, describing commando operations across multiple different campaigns and years of the war. It reflects, in large part, a deliberate element of how these units were trained from the very beginning, built around the principle that a small assault force could not afford to become bogged down attempting to overcome a single strong point through sheer weight of fire, and needed instead to maintain constant forward momentum, finding alternative routes, exploiting gaps, and relying on speed and initiative at every level of command down to the individual soldier. German defenders, trained within a more hierarchical system where junior soldiers typically awaited orders before making significant tactical decisions, found this constant distributed initiative deeply disorientating, since it meant that even successfully repelling one element of an assault often did nothing to halt the wider attack, which simply continued to develop through whatever gap or weakness had been found elsewhere. The Normandy landings of June 1944 produced perhaps the most extensively documented examples of this reputation in action, as commando units played a crucial role in the fighting immediately following the initial beach assaults. Lord Lovat's Commando Brigade, landing on Sword Beach, had been tasked with a mission of genuine urgency, pushing rapidly inland to relieve airborne troops who had seized the vital bridges over the Caen Canal and the River Orne in the early hours of the invasion, bridges that needed to be held against determined German counterattacks until the wider seaborne invasion force could properly consolidate its position. German units defending the approaches to those bridges, having already fought through a tense night against lightly equipped airborne troops, now found themselves facing a fresh, heavily armed commando force, advancing with a determination that several accounts describe as almost unnerving in its consistency. A German defender positioned along the route of that advance later recalled that his unit had expected the approaching British force to slow down or pause upon encountering resistance, as most infantry formations reasonably would after an exhausting beach landing, yet the commandos instead maintained a steady, relentless pace, pushing through ambush points and delaying positions with what he described as an almost business-like efficiency that left his own men uncertain how to effectively slow the advance at all. The famous story of that advance being accompanied by bagpipe music, played openly and audibly as the commandos pushed forward under fire, has become one of the most enduring images of the entire Normandy campaign, and German testimony from soldiers positioned along that route consistently confirms just how unsettling this detail proved to be in the moment. Soldiers who had already endured a chaotic night of fighting against airborne troops now found themselves listening to the same eerie, defiant sound that Highland regiments had carried into battle for decades, growing steadily louder as the relief force closed the distance despite continued resistance along the way. One German officer, reviewing the failure of his own defensive line to meaningfully delay this advance, wrote afterward that the psychological effect of watching an attacking force continue forward, seemingly indifferent to casualties, accompanied by music rather than silence, had contributed as much to his men's loss of confidence as the actual weight of fire being directed against them. Later in 1944, the assault on the fortified Dutch island of Walcheren provided another striking demonstration of this same quality, executed under conditions that many military planners considered close to impossible. German defenses on Walcheren had been deliberately strengthened through the flooding of large portions of the island, creating a landscape of waterlogged polders and narrow causeways that channeled any attacking force into predictable, heavily defended approach routes covered by artillery, machine guns, and coastal batteries positioned with commanding fields of fire. Commando units tasked with assaulting this position were forced to advance through freezing floodwater, sometimes waist-deep or higher, under continuous and accurate fire, in conditions that German defenders genuinely believed would make a successful assault effectively impossible. Survivors among the German garrison later described watching amphibious vehicles and wading infantry continue to press forward despite catastrophic losses among the leading waves, boats and vehicles destroyed in the shallows, soldiers wading through open water under direct fire with seemingly nowhere to take cover. And yet still, position by position, the attack continued to gain ground. A German coastal artillery officer stationed on Valkaren, captured after the position finally fell, gave an account that captures this dynamic with particular clarity. He described watching an entire assault wave essentially destroyed in the shallows in front of his position, boats burning, water churned by explosions, and genuinely believing in the moment that the attack had been decisively broken and that no further assault could reasonably follow through such devastation. Within a remarkably short space of time, however, a second wave pressed forward through the same killing ground, using the wrecked boats and floating debris from the first attempt as partial cover, continuing to advance with what he could only describe as a complete disregard for the odds against them succeeding. His own position was eventually overrun, not because his men had run out of ammunition or fighting spirit, but because the attacking force simply refused to stop coming regardless of the cost, a phenomenon he admitted in his own post-war reflection on the engagement, that nothing in his prior training or experience had adequately prepared him to withstand psychologically whatever preparations had been made physically in terms of fortification and firepower. This pattern extended into the Italian campaign as well, where commando units conducted a series of raids and amphibious assaults along the coastline, including the difficult fighting around Termoli in October 1943, where a small commando force held a critical bridgehead against determined German armored counterattacks for far longer than their numbers alone would reasonably have suggested was possible. German panzer crews involved in that counterattack later described considerable frustration at their inability to dislodge a defending force that seemed to reorganize and continue resisting even after individual positions had apparently been overrun. Soldiers falling back to new positions and continuing to fight rather than surrendering once their initial line had been broken, buying crucial time for reinforcements to arrive and stabilize what had briefly seemed like a genuine crisis for the wider Allied advance in that sector. It is worth examining more closely just how deliberately this quality of relentless forward momentum was cultivated within commando training, because it did not emerge by accident, nor was it simply a product of unusually brave individual soldiers happening to find themselves grouped together in the same units. From the very earliest days of selection, candidates were pushed through exercises specifically designed to test and build the capacity to continue functioning effectively under conditions of extreme physical exhaustion, injury, and apparent hopelessness. Training instructors deliberately structured exercises so that recruits faced escalating difficulty precisely when they felt most depleted, forcing them to complete demanding tasks, not when they were fresh and capable, but when every instinct urged them to stop. This was not sadism for its own sake, but a calculated recognition that real combat rarely allowed soldiers the luxury of fighting only when conditions were favorable, and that the units most likely to succeed in genuinely desperate situations were those whose soldiers had already, through repeated and deliberately brutal training, discovered that they were capable of continuing to function long after their bodies and minds had first signaled that they could not. German intelligence officers who studied, captured training manuals, and interrogated prisoners about their preparation gradually built up a reasonably accurate picture of just how systematically this resilience had been instilled. And several wartime assessments specifically noted it as a factor distinguishing commando units from otherwise comparably equipped conventional infantry formations. One German intelligence summary, prepared for senior officers likely to face commando operations in their own sector, explicitly warned that these units should not be expected to withdraw or surrender under circumstances that would typically prompt conventional troops to do so, and recommended that defensive planning account for the probability of continued resistance or continued assault well beyond the point at which an engagement might normally be considered decided. This represents a genuinely unusual level of specific, tailored intelligence guidance, and it speaks to just how seriously German military planning had come to take this particular characteristic by the middle years of the war. The human cost of maintaining this relentless standard should not be understated or glossed over in service of a purely heroic narrative, because the same qualities that made these units so effective also meant that casualties among commando forces were frequently severe, sometimes catastrophically so, across many of their most celebrated operations. Surviving veterans and the families of those who did not survive have been candid in post-war accounts and oral histories about the genuine and lasting toll this style of warfare exacted, physically and psychologically, on the men who fought this way repeatedly across multiple campaigns. Several veterans interviewed decades later described a persistent, lifelong difficulty in fully processing experiences that had asked them again and again to continue advancing or continue resisting through circumstances that any reasonable assessment would have judged as effectively hopeless. An ongoing psychological weight that the simple, celebratory framing of these engagements as impressive military achievements often fails to adequately acknowledge. There is also a technical and organizational dimension to this reputation that deserves attention, alongside the more psychological and training-focused explanations already discussed. Commando units benefited from a degree of operational flexibility and pre-planning that allowed individual soldiers considerable latitude to adapt to changing circumstances without needing to wait for orders from above. A structural feature that reinforced the individual initiative already instilled through training. Section and troop level leaders were deliberately given wide discretion to make tactical decisions on the spot, trusted by their superiors to interpret the overall objective of an operation and adapt their specific actions to achieve it, even when circumstances diverged significantly from the original plan. This meant that the loss of a senior officer, an event that could critically disrupt the effectiveness of more rigidly hierarchical formations, rarely caused a commando assault to lose coherence entirely, since junior leaders throughout the force had already been trained and empowered to continue pursuing the mission's objective using their own judgment. German officers who studied, captured operational orders and after-action reports from these engagements repeatedly noted this distributed leadership structure as a significant factor in explaining why commando attacks so often continued to develop effectively even after suffering officer casualties that, in a conventional formation, might reasonably have been expected to cause the entire assault to stall or collapse. Equipment and specialized preparation also played a meaningful role in sustaining this capacity for continued action under adverse conditions, though German accounts consistently suggest that hardware alone cannot fully explain what they witnessed. Commando units typically carried lighter, more streamlined equipment loads than conventional infantry, prioritizing mobility and the ability to move quickly over sustained firepower or heavy defensive equipment, a choice that reflected the underlying philosophy that speed and continued forward momentum represented the unit's primary tactical advantage, rather than an ability to win prolonged firefights through superior weight of fire. This lighter loadout, combined with specialized training in swimming, climbing, and movement across difficult terrain, meant these units could physically access and sustain movement through terrain and conditions that would have proven genuinely impassable or exhausting for more conventionally equipped infantry. a factor that contributed directly to incidents like the flooded assault on Walcheren, where the ability to continue moving through waist-deep water under fire depended as much on physical conditioning and appropriate equipment as on sheer willpower alone. Perhaps the most telling evidence of just how deeply this reputation had embedded itself within German military thinking comes from instances where German commanders altered their own defensive doctrine, specifically in anticipation of facing commando forces, moving beyond simple respect for their fighting capability into active structural changes in how positions were prepared and defended. Some German units, upon learning that commando forces were likely to be operating in their sector, began constructing defense in-depth arrangements specifically designed around the assumption that any initial defensive line would likely be breached regardless of its strength, focusing instead on layered secondary positions intended to slow and eventually exhaust an attacking force that could not realistically be expected to simply stop at the first line of resistance. This represents a genuinely significant tactical adaptation, an acknowledgement embedded directly into defensive planning, that conventional assumptions about how much resistance a defended position could reasonably expect to absorb before an attacker withdrew simply did not apply when the attacking force in question wore the green beret. Paint a remarkably consistent picture across multiple years of the war and multiple different theaters of combat. German soldiers who faced commando units did not describe them as simply well-armed or numerically strong, since in nearly every documented engagement, the attacking or defending commando force was considerably smaller than the German units opposing them. What they described instead, again and again, in terms that varied in specific wording but never in underlying substance, was a force that refused to be discouraged by casualties, that adapted immediately to unexpected resistance rather than pausing to reconsider, and that maintained forward momentum or defensive resolve under conditions that, by any conventional military calculation, should reasonably have caused it to break, withdraw, or surrender considerably sooner than it ever actually did. That reputation, built engagement by engagement across the full span of the war, ultimately became one of the Commandos' most valuable assets in its own right, a psychological weapon that operated independently of whatever specific tactical situation any individual unit happened to find itself facing. German soldiers who had heard about Walcheren or Dieppe or the advance to relieve the bridges above Sword Beach carried that knowledge with them into their own encounters with commando forces, and accumulated unwelcome awareness that whatever resistance they managed to offer, the men coming toward them through smoke, floodwater, or darkness had, time and again across years of documented combat, simply proven impossible to stop through conventional means alone.